heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 338, covering the week of January 2nd through January 6th, 2023. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Facebook and our Gab pages, and subscribe to our YouTube page. All those social media accounts are available at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE institute.org. While you're there, give us that email address. We'll give you a free ebook exploring the Southern tradition. You get on our email list, and when you're on our email list, that's how we contact you. And we contact you about our Daily Dose of Dixie, which is all of our articles that are produced every day during the week, also forthcoming events and fundraising opportunities. This is how we keep in contact with you. So please whitelist us when you subscribe to the email list. In other words, add us to your contact list when you get that first email. That way you don't miss what we're doing. Also, please don't unsubscribe from the list. I know you're going to get a lot of emails from us, but again, this is how we stay in touch with you. It is the most valuable thing that we have is that email list. So as all social media changes, the email list becomes very, very important. Also, if you're on abbevilleinstitute.org, you can click on that support button or click on the donate button. We exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like the podcast, the website, the conferences, all the things that we're going to do in 2023, and there's going to be a lot, you want to give us that financial support. We cannot exist without it. So it is all tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so please make that donation. Also, you can click on the shop tab and get our logo and all kinds of nice, high-quality materials. Lots of great ways to support the Institute, but always rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Let people know you like it. Share it around on social media. Share our material around on social media. That way people can read what we're doing and get involved with the Institute. And just a reminder, we do have a great event coming up in April 13th through 16th, 2023. It's at Callaway Gardens in beautiful Pine Mountain, Georgia. It's a wonderful time of the year to be at Callaway Gardens. It is a true resort. And what I mean by that is it has the gardens, it has bike paths, walking paths, it has a golf course. It is a beautiful place to be, a beach. And so you're going to want to come out to it. Not only is the content of the conference going to be fantastic, it's again our 20th anniversary, but it's also a beautiful environment. Now, registration for that does close March 14th. So if you're listening to this, you've only got about 2.5 months to make your reservations and get on board with the event. We have to close that a month before the event, so March 14th. And we do want you to get your room reserved and also get your conference fee in so we can get everything finalized. But it's going to be a wonderful time, and we do want to see you there. Now, hope you had a great new year. We've been off the podcast now for about 3 weeks. And so it's been a little while, and I'm excited to be back with it. Excited to be back in the saddle, so to speak, with the podcast. We've got a lot of great things in store for 2023. One thing I will tell you is that we're going to be updating our events page early on this year when we finalize a couple of things, and you'll be able to plan for your entire year with Abbeville Institute events. We've got a lot of great webinars, Zoom webinars coming up. We are trying to plan a couple of conferences. We're trying to do some things so that you can have events to attend with the Institute, not just our podcast, not just our website, but also these other events that we have going on. So there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes. We, of course, have the 1607 project that's going to be released this year. We're going to try to produce more videos and do things like that. So a lot of fantastic things in the works for the Abbeville Institute. And again, we only can do that with your help and your support. But check out that events page at abbevilleinstitute.org. We are going to be updating that very, very soon to put down the dates that we're going to do things. We don't necessarily have the topics yet, but we will have dates assigned for these events that we have coming up. Now, I'm really excited about 2023, and I hope you are too. Also, our app. I didn't mention our app. Our app is going to be back available on Apple devices very shortly. And so if you want the mobile app, which is free of charge to you, you can download it. You can already get it on Google, but if you don't have it on your Apple device, you will be able to do that very, very shortly. So that's another great thing we've got coming back this year. All right, well, let's talk about the material for the week. Long-winded introduction there and commercial for the Institute because it has been a few weeks since we've been on the podcast. But we got great stuff this week, and we're back at it January 2nd, day after New Year's. We're ready to go, ready to keep our mission alive and exploring what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And we start with a piece on Thomas Jefferson from Professor Holochak. Now, this piece actually works quite well with everything else we did. We actually bookended this week with two, I would say, more intellectual pieces. We have this, and then we have a piece that came from our 2005 summer school by Professor Bill Wilson on Lincoln and civil religion. And so these two intellectual pieces fit nicely with the material we have in the middle of the week. They sandwich them together. But what Professor Holochak talks about in this piece on Jefferson, and we're going to be doing a lot of Thomas Jefferson this year. He's asked if he can produce a weekly piece on Jefferson, or close to a weekly piece on Jefferson, and I was all for it, because Jefferson really is the key to understanding the Southern tradition. Politically, his position on federalism became the dominant strain of thought in the South. Jefferson's view on small government was also the dominant strain of the South. Southerners, and Jefferson was a man of the gentry. I mean, he was a man of the landed aristocracy in the South, and that cavalier culture was certainly part of Jefferson's life. Now, he was further to the left on a lot of issues than many Southerners, but Jefferson's belief in local was key. And, when talking with us about Don Livingston and why he made Jefferson the image of the Institute, he said, really, the only thing Jefferson doesn't have is religion. And, of course, we have other examples of that in the South, but Jefferson certainly didn't want to rock the boat in a way that was going to disrupt the South. He had visions of the South that were different than, say, maybe a traditional Southerner at the time, but a traditional Southerner later on, I should say, in the 19th century. But Jefferson, as Holochak points out, was aware, keenly aware, of limitations and the right time to do things. This is the important part of this first piece that he talks about. Jefferson, the right time to die, the right time to do things in life. And for example, on the issue of slavery, Jefferson was, of course, against slavery, but he didn't think the time was right in his own lifetime to get rid of it. He thought that the time would be right later on, that perhaps the time would be right in the future, where you would have the opportunity to eliminate the institution and do it properly so that all people would have benefit from it. He just didn't think Americans were ready for it in his lifetime. And of course, he dies in 1826. But Holochak also brings out the stoicism of Jefferson in this. Jefferson and the right time to die, for example. Jefferson and a belief in when was the proper time to have an expiration point, for example. Now, Jefferson compared this to fruit, right? That each thing in life, each biological thing in life has an expiration point. He talked about old age, being past your expiration point and your usefulness in life, and how younger people should have a say in life. And he made statements about that throughout his life, that the earth belongs to the living. But this didn't mean that Jefferson was against tradition. And he wasn't. He was certainly, again, rooted in Virginia. His gaze didn't go beyond Virginia. And he understood the traditions and cultures and customs of Virginia mattered. And he didn't want to necessarily eliminate those, particularly not in his own lifetime. He thought maybe in the future. It's his letter to the Danbury Baptists. And he says, one day, maybe the people of Connecticut can actually see the light about religious freedom, and they'll go with that. But right now, essentially, is not the time. And the general government, by the way, is not going to get involved and do this. We're not going to tell you what to do. Now, you could say this is a cop-out. And people have said this about Jefferson. Well, it's a cop-out. Jefferson was not very principled then, because a principled man would have been for these things and forced people to do those kind of things. That would have been Lincoln. You see, that would have been the radical Republicans. That would have been the New England mind compared to the Southern mind. Because in the New England mind, you would have had an aggressive effort to make sure people did what you wanted them to do. It's a cultural imperialism that New England started to use really in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, much more aggressively than at any point before that. New England certainly wanted to be left alone in the colonial period. They didn't want the South to affect New England, and the South didn't want New England to affect them. This is where you have people like Roger Sherman and John Hancock and Sam Adams vigorously supporting federalism because federalism worked. They didn't want New England affected by someone else. And this is where you have the Essex Junto, for example, in New England, supporting secession, nullification, trying to keep the South from affecting them. But there was a shift in the middle of the 19th century. And that shift came because there were people coming out of New England like Charles Sumner who wanted to make America New England. They had a much more aggressive view of culture and tradition from their own side and wanted to make the rest of America like them because they thought they had a righteous cause or a righteous backing to do it. And so some of this has a theological origin to it. But again, as Professor Wilson points out in the Friday piece, a lot of this became a secular religion. And government became the vehicle by which to remake society in the image of God, at least in their own mind. Government was the way. Government was the opportunity. Government was the be-all, end-all of their vision. And so government would be used to ensure that everyone lived like New England. And so this civil religion and this belief in these secular documents like the Declaration or the Constitution becomes an important part of understanding the mindset of the Yankee in the middle of the 19th century. Now, Lincoln just became the symbol of that. And this is the Lincoln myth that Bill Wilson talks about. And it's something that we have today. And he brings up in the last part of this talk from 2005, nearly 20 years ago now, the last part of this talk, where he mentions Mel Bradford. And he says, the problem with a modern American society is that people are too invested in Lincoln to even consider another side of Honest Abe. Now, again, he says this in 2005. That was only a few years after Thomas DiLorenzo had published The Real Lincoln, to either acclaim or disparagement by a substantial part of the American population. But this is a time when people were starting to reevaluate Lincoln. This is before you had a pretty large portion of the American population start to reconsider the Lincoln myth. Now, it doesn't mean that they've abandoned it entirely. And even things like pieces like Lerone Bennett's book on Lincoln and race and the Modern 1619 Project, which is highly critical of Abraham Lincoln. All of them have a different kind of slant on it, though in some ways they're correct. I mean, look, the 1619 Project is critical of Lincoln for not being on board enough with civil rights and ending slavery, and Lincoln really wasn't those things. This is something that people have to understand about Lincoln, but creating the myth is much more popular, particularly for New Englander, because the New Englander has to be right. The New Englander the Yankee has to be right. Now, I'm going to say this again. The Yankee is not a Northerner. The Yankee is a particular type of Northerner, like Charles Sumner, like Thad Stevens, who's not from New England, but from Pennsylvania. This type of Northerner has an aggressive spirit to him that's going to ensure that they live like they want you to live, right? So there's a certain type of cultural imperialism to it. And they're going to aggressively pursue it. You see this on the progressive left, most importantly, but you also see it sometimes on the progressive right, and you certainly see it with the Straussians and others. The Straussians, of course, are heavily invested in the Lincoln myth because they think it shields them from any types of charges of bad things, right? Well, if they're Lincolnian, well, then they can't be racists, and they can't be anything bad, anything that the left will throw at them. This is Harry Jaffe's position that equality is conservative. He wanted to ensure that he took the sting out of the leftist charges against the right, because these emotional charges like racism, sexism, classism, all these things become very powerful in the 20th century because we live in an emotivist age. So he thought, well, if I can make these things, if I can make equality, for example, conservative, I can take that off the table. We don't have to worry about that anymore. But they think that Lincoln was right, but we have to stop with Lincoln. We can't go any further with the reforms. But what Lincoln did by advocating a civil religion, and this is what Professor Wilson talks about, by advocating a civil religion and by pursuing what would be at the time a leftist agenda, because the radical Republicans were leftists. They were not conservatives. And no matter how hard conservatives try, they can't make radical Republicans conservative. This is what Dabney was pointing out. These people aren't conservative, and the northern conservatives are simply going to accept the discarded revolutionary tendencies of their forefathers and call them conservatives. This is where you have the West Coast Straussians. This is where you have the neoconservatives. This is what they do. So the fact is, you've got these people that believe in a civil religion or civic religion, and Lincoln made it clear in 1838, the Lyceum Address. This is what he wanted to do. The Declaration and the Constitution would become sacrosanct documents. They would be sacred. They would say things like, our government is sacred, democracy is sacred, our Constitution is sacred, our Declaration is sacred. Now, before this point, the only things that were sacred were holy relics. And if you're from a Protestant side, there aren't many things that would be considered sacred except the Word of God, right? The Bible itself. If you're a Catholic or an Anglican, there would be sacred relics. There would be things besides the Bible itself that would be sacred. But the Word of God, above all, would be sacred. And what Lincoln did in the Lyceum Address is say we need a new civil religion, and it has to be government. It has to be these documents and these metaphysical things like democracy, and this metaphysical thing like this abstraction of liberty. These are all abstractions. To the north, these are abstractions. Liberty is an abstraction. And there was a way they viewed it, which was collective liberty, but it still was an abstraction. And so abstractions become concrete things, and it's a beatific vision of this sacred government. And there was a painting. It's in the book by a man named Goldfield, America Aflame. He used a painting from Thomas Nast he made after the war was over. And it's an image of a woman standing on a balcony. And there's all these Union soldiers dressed as crusaders. And in the distance you have essentially the South needs to be remade. And you have also this kind of beatific vision of what America is. But these crusaders going out for a religious zeal, and that religious zeal would be liberty, Lady Liberty, democracy, and this kind of view of government. It's fascinating. These people had abandoned any type of real religion and replaced it with a civic religion. Now, Professor Wilson would say to them, this is a real religion, and he points to the fact that you have people weave this into their belief systems. Once you focus your attention on something, you are a monotheist. You believe in the one religion, the one God, and that could be Lincoln, who's now in the Parthenon in America. Or you could be a polytheist. You could be someone who changes your allegiance as things go along. But there would be, one God among many. There's also that kind of beliefs, and he talks about that too. There's one more primary God than the others, and maybe Lincoln is that. And he calls this also nationalism. Maybe the American nation is that. There's many nations, but there's only one true nation, and that is the United States, and that is the Lincolnian myth. Maybe there's that. But in all these cases, the state and Lincoln have replaced a Christian God, and this has led people to worship government, to worship democracy, to worship the state, to call the Capitol sacred, this hallowed ground, to go to the Lincoln Memorial in hushed tones and put flowers and worship. This is what people did in Greece and Rome when they would go to the temples, the political temples. We forget that in Rome, maybe you may not know this, maybe you do know this, but maybe you forget. In Rome, current Caesars would be given temples, and they would be worshipped as gods. And in the case of our political leaders, there are people that want that to happen. There are people that are worship as God. I mean, in a recent example, who she's now dead, but would be Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There was this very strange cult around her. You would go into the bookstore, and there were calendars about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and dozens of books, and of course, all kinds of iconography about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's only a matter of time before we do have some type of statue created for her, these kind of things. She is worshipped as a god on the left. And this is, I mean, it's apparent. Now, you don't see as much of it anymore because she's dead, but I think it's only a matter of time before these things start coming back again, as her reputation is revived in the next decade or so. And I think, again, the left is going to do that. There's going to be all kinds of worship around Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But there's others. I mean, you have other leftist heroes and other leftist gods who would be in that particular pantheon, in that orbit for the left. And of course, all of them go back to Abraham Lincoln, the one true God above all others. And this is why we have the Lincoln Memorial. Now, you could say, what about Washington? Well, the Washington Monument's different. It's a monument. It's not a memorial. It's a monument. And it's an obelisk, of course. And there's no image. I mean, it's this obelisk. It's not a statue of Washington himself. It's a representation of the Rock of Washington and holding the Union together. I think there's something about that there. And of course, when you look at John Warwick Daniel, who was there when the monument was dedicated in the 1880s, he made a firm reference to Virginia and culture and tradition in that monument. Of course, there was no Lincoln Memorial at that point. We know that the South eventually got their way and had the Jefferson Memorial placed in D.C. along with the Lincoln Memorial as kind of a concession. This is Franklin Roosevelt's concession to the South. But certainly we have these secular deities, and the Lincoln is foremost among them, and this worship of the state. And look, Jefferson would not have wanted this for himself. I don't believe at all. But and I'm not even sure Lincoln would have, or Washington. But we have them, and we've gotten this type of religion in America. And Lincoln was very open about wanting that because he thought it was beneficial for American society. So that's why these two things are important. Lincoln, though, if Jefferson was correct, should have been a ripe fruit. And he should have, died away and gone. He's gone. And that myth should have died on the vine too, because the myth has been exposed as a fraud. But yet, we have people that will refuse to do away with it because it becomes such an important part of their identity and understanding of American society. You cannot have their identity without that Lincoln myth. That's American nationalism now. And so you have a lot going on here, of course, in the way that these things develop in the United States today with political ideology and in American politics. So we have these two great bookends. And then we have the material in the middle of the week, and the short little piece by Clyde Wilson on a new book from Shotwell Press. The book is The Burning of Columbia, South Carolina. It's edited by Karen Stokes, who is, just by herself, is a very good historian from South Carolina. But it's a republication from Dr. Trezevant, who was a Columbia, South Carolina physician who was there and gave an eyewitness testimony of the burning of Columbia, South Carolina. And so this is the Lincoln myth being challenged. This is Southerners saying, wait a second here. There's a lot more to this Lincoln myth than what you're letting on. This man and his army were tyrannical. These people were not righteous cause mythologists. These people were not for the good of American society. These people were not interested in anything but their own power and their willingness to abuse it to have their ends. And this is something Bill Wilson talked about at the end of his piece as well. We cannot break free from the Lincoln myth, because if we did so, this kind of stuff would be dangerous to our understanding and the fabric of American society now. It would be dangerous to the righteous cause myth. And if you don't have the righteous cause myth, well then, in some ways, You don't have any ground for the New Englander, the Yankee, to stand on and say they're better than everybody else. And it creates a very uncomfortable situation for Americans, because maybe some charges against the United States are then true. Maybe there's parts of the Southern tradition that are true. Well, we know there are. Maybe the critiques from Black Americans against New Englanders then would be true, that you weren't really that committed to this. And that makes them, this is the thing that you have to understand, that makes them very uncomfortable. The charge that perhaps Americans were not committed to the proposition nation, that it was just a bunch of hot air, makes Northern Americans uncomfortable, because they have firmly digested it, and it's become part of their soul that they were right in all of this, and that they were committed to it, and that they've always been interested in doing X, Y, and Z to help these poor downtrodden people. But when Black Americans stand up and say, wait a second, no, I don't think you have, that makes them very uncomfortable, because it's part of their being. If you believe in the proposition nation myth, then this is going to make you uncomfortable when these charges are leveled against you. Now, you could say that certainly there were people that tried over time, and this would be Jefferson. Well, it just wasn't right. We had to go move along, and it took time for all these things. We couldn't do this immediately. But then, of course, Jefferson is criticized for that position, because there's never a positive outcome to this that will suit and satisfy these charges. This is where the proposition nation myth is really just that, a myth. And it should fall apart and die on the vine, because we know practically nobody really believed it. We see it in the action of people rather than just their words and deeds. But this is great because, again, the title is Another Eyewitness to Union War Crimes. If there is a Lincoln myth, then you can punch holes in it with books like The Burning of Columbia, South Carolina from Shotwell Press in 2022. By the way, if you're not getting Shotwell Press, you should. You should get their books, get on their website, and get their updates on the new material they have coming out. They have a lot of great stuff that comes out on a regular basis. We just don't have enough reviews of them as they come out. If you want to do some reviews, let me know. You can send an email, mcclanahan@abbevilleinstitute.org, and let me know you're interested in reviewing. We really want reviews of more books, but it does take time and effort to get those. So just let me know if you're interested in doing that. And then, of course, we had a couple of really fun pieces this week on culture. And I said, they're bookended. Culture is not a religion. Politics should flow downstream from culture. And when you put this religious proposition nation myth in people's minds, there's a block there. And so when you have a piece by Casey Chalk on Thursday, The Backcountry Wisdom of Lester Flatt, and you read this, it's hilarious. Lester Flatt, of course, the great bluegrass musician who wrote some really fantastic songs. And his social critique of the 1960s was tremendous. 1950s, 1940s. This is tradition. This is the traditional South running headlong into progressive America. And he's saying there's something wrong with all of this stuff, because he's coming from a culture and a society that was not being bowled over by ideology. And when you have Casey Chalk points this out, when you have a Supreme Court nominee sit before a committee in Congress and ask to define a woman, and she says, I can't do that. I don't know what that means. You have ideology taking over reality. You have ideology taking over tradition. And ideology, in this way, it becomes a religion. This is the Lincoln myth on steroids. This is where you have Jefferson would say, I might believe that things need to change, but the time is not right. And the time is not right, and so the change has to come when the people are ready for it, but maybe some changes aren't necessarily good changes. And then, of course, you have Bill Wilson pointing out, well, when it becomes a religion, though, no time is ever wrong to make these changes. And the religion becomes ideology. The proposition nation. And now that Proposition Nation has been transferred to all kinds of things. And so this is where, this is where we have a real disconnect in American society, because we think that politics then creates culture, and it's the other way around. Politics should be a reflection of culture, and this is where the left always gets upset in the South, because in many times it still is. In many cases it still is, and this is what I love about this particular piece by Casey Chalk. And then, of course, we have a great little piece by Brandon Meeks again, Boy Meets Girl, and it's a wonderful dialogue of a date and the influence of people and place and how people would relate to each other, even in the realm of dating. And what I've seen something very interesting recently. Now, supposedly, if you ask someone where they're from, that's some kind of dog whistle. But this is what people in the South do all the time. This is how you get to know people. Where are you from and who are your people? Well, if you know that you're a descendant from these people and you're from this place, well, you can kind of get an idea for who these people are going to be. It doesn't mean you can't break free from some of that, and you can't have different opinions or different views or do things a little differently. But all those things are eventually going to come back in you. And so knowing where people are from and knowing who their people are becomes a very important part of who they are. And that's what this piece, I think, does a great job in showing, is that matters. Where you're from matters. And you could say this about America writ large. Where you're from matters. The South matters. New England matters. The Midwest matters. The West matters. The West Coast matters. Your culture should be upstream from politics. It almost always is. We just try to invert that now. And politics has become such a religion that we think that that's the most important thing. But at the end of the day, it really does matter where you're from. And this is what the great comedic value of the Brandon Meeks piece, because it's just funny how he goes through this. So we had a lot of great stuff this week at the Institute. I'm really excited for 2023. I hope you are too, for what we're going to do this year. And we want your input. If there's something you want to see, something you want to hear, something you want us to write about, feel free to send me an email. Again, if you have article submissions, you want something that you want to see on the website, send us that submission. We don't publish everything, but go ahead and send it along anyways for consideration, because we do like to get you involved in the process too. This is a fellowship, right? Our organization is a fellowship of like-minded people who simply want to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, and who think the South and the Southern tradition has much to offer in modern American society. As we look at all these contentious things that are going on now, that this tradition certainly matters because culture matters. And that's why we do the things like music and literature, along with politics and art and all the other things we do in our daily routine at the website. All right. Until next time, good day.